Hi everyone, this is For the Love of Comics, where if you're new here, we celebrate the breadth and the depth of the comics medium. Usually I do this by spotlighting some of my favorite comics, but every now and then I also talk about some comics that may become my favorites in the future because they happen to be recent reads or new acquisitions that I'm hoping to read in the upcoming weeks. This is one such episode, and in recent weeks I have grouped these together by geography, by focusing on European comics and Indian comics, as well as our very first live stream in which I looked at classic comics in box sets and collections, and I'll link all of these and other videos like these in the description below. In this video, I'm going to be talking about 4 comics that I've recently read, as well as right at the end of the video, I'll mention 2 comics that I'm going to get to next. And what all of these comics have in common is that they're all by writer artists. One of the many reasons why I love comics is because they're such an incredibly collaborative medium. You have a writer and an artist often collaborating to create a comic, and even an artist can be a penciler and an inker and a letterer. So you usually have 2, 3, 4, 5 people, 6 people involved in bringing out a comic. But on the flip side of that, comics can also be an incredibly individualistic medium. By being both the writer and the artist of a work, some people are able to imbue their stories with a very idiosyncratic flavor. In that way, comics are sometimes like movies, sometimes like plays where you have a whole bunch of people, and at other times more like a novel where you have a single voice really in control of the whole thing. A viewer of this channel referred to these type of comics, those that are written and drawn by the same person, as auteur comics, and I quite like that term. I believe it comes from film theory, where you have a singular vision determining the look and feel of a movie rather than a studio, and that's definitely the case for the books that we're going to be talking about today. All of these comics are born of extremely singular visions and are unmistakably the work of their creators. So let's jump right into this quick look at 4 auteur comics that I've recently read. The first book I'd like to talk about today is by a creator whom I've never read before. This is Rich Tomasso. At least I don't believe I've read any works of his before, and the book is Spy Seal, the Corten Steel Phoenix. This is published by Image Comics, but you could be forgiven for thinking it's one of those European albums like the Tintin, Asterix, Blake and Mortimer, and the other comics we've been talking about recently, and that is no accident. Rich Tomasso's story of a seal. This is a story of a world populated by anthropomorphic animals. Rich Tomasso's story is very much in the vein of Hergé and those European masters. It's done in a lean clair style. The colors are flat and pastelish and very pleasing. And even the nation-hopping adventure story of espionage is very reminiscent of those European classics. I don't know why, but I expected this to be a sort of children's or an all-ages story, but it has a definite adult sensibility in it. While the violence or the situations never gets into totally adult levels, and some parts of it can feel slapsticky and comedic, there is still this adventure, thrill, sneaky, snarky, tongue-in-cheek style that was terrifically suited to this animal story. When I read a description of it, it said it's like Tintin meets Usagi Yojimbo, and I'm not quite sure about that description. I think it's definitely Tintin-esque in some ways, and it's definitely about anthropomorphic animals, but it's very much its own thing. Although it's not as simple or simplistic as a children's story might be expected to be, it's not very complicated and twisty either. Rather, the tongue-in-cheek nature of it and the blending of the genres and the way the tone goes between playful and serious felt very different from American comics, which I think is keeping with Rich Tomasso's idea of making a more European feeling comic. It's not very easily classified identifiable, but there's obviously a lot of love and care in this story. And although this works perfectly well as a standalone story, I really wouldn't mind seeing more stories of Spy Seal, the hero over here, who gets recruited into the MI6 in this kind of ludicrous way, but after that he is a spy for the British government. So there's no reason why he shouldn't have more adventures and find himself in more pickles. So for sure, if I see any more Spy Seal stories out there in the future, I'll definitely be snapping them up. After Spy Seal by Rich Tommaso, which is the first book of Rich Tommaso's that I've ever read, we get to a book which is the second book by a writer-artist. And this is Dylan Horrocks, and the book is Sam Zabel and the Magic Pen. I read Dylan Horrocks' Hicksville many years ago, and Sam Zabel was a character in that previous book. Hicksville, if you haven't read it, is a fantastic comic that every fan of comics should read. It's deeply steeped in comics mythology and lore, but at the same time, it's this fantasy which on its surface is just a valentine to comics artists and writers, talking about a small town in New Zealand in which everyone is a comic scholar and Action Comics #1 is in the comic book store or the libraries, and everyone's talking about Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman. It's just a fantastic comic done in such a simple way that you don't even realize how serious and how deep some of its themes run. I've been very excited about Sam Zabel and the Magic Pen for many years. I've been trying to get my hands on it ever since I read an extract from it in a small magazine or a small comics issue that Fantagraphics had brought out, and I was glad to finally get my hands on it through a used copy that I found online. Sam Zabel and the Magic Pen, very much like Hicksville, is a fairy tale about comic books. It tells the story of Sam Zabel, a comic book artist from New Zealand who has both an independent self-published comic series that he hasn't worked on for many years and also writes as a writer for hire. Even though he's a writer artist, he's mainly writing for a superhero comic series in the United States. Dylan Horrocks, I believe, has written Batgirl among other superhero comics, so the autobiographical elements of this are very clear. In fact, the independent creator-owned comic series that Sam Zabel writes and draws is called Pickle, which is the exact same name of Dylan Horrocks' comic. In this story, Sam Zabel finds an obscure New Zealand comic from the 1950s in a comic book store and then magically finds himself transported into that world. What already sounds like an interesting idea is expanded upon brilliantly by Dylan Horrocks, because he takes this sort of frustrated, stuck, depressed writer artist inside a comic book world that was created by another comic book writer artist many years ago, and then goes from that into an exploration of the imagination, of fantasy, because there's something, the magic pen of this title, that allows people to enter into the comic books they draw. And from this, very much like Hicksville thematically, but very different in its structure and approach, Sam Zabel and the Magic Pen becomes a comics hopping, genre hopping comic adventure full of all kinds of questions about identity and what we would do if we had the power to make our dreams come true. And it's also extremely sexual. There's a lot of eroticism in it, which I guess is to be expected if you're talking about fantasy and what kind of a world you would like to live in. But the moral and ethical questions about this get deeper and more significant as the story goes on. And by the time you're getting to the climax of it, things have gotten quite dark and serious. I don't think I can spoil this book because it's really about the charm and the whimsy and the imagination that is at play in this very ambitious and very artistic story, which is quite a potboiler, quite pleasing, with a very cartoony art style that at the same time ends up being being extremely expressive. Especially there are all these green alien women who are naked most of the time and all they want to do is sleep with this god who created them, the comic book artist, writer god. And it's incredible how Dylan Horrocks gets so many expressions on their faces, from passion to naughtiness to mischievous to sad to depressed, with very few simple lines. Reading this book put me in such a good mood that I just had to pick up Hicksville and start rereading it again and revisiting Sam Zabel at an earlier stage in his life. Sam Zabel and the Magic Pen does not need you to have read Hicksville, but I would say that if you can find either or both of these books, I highly recommend you pick them up, especially if you are a fan, as I said, of comics lore and mythology and the way that commercial versus artistic, popular versus intellectual, indie versus big two superhero material is combined and discussed. I think especially for regular viewers of this channel, it's as if these books have been written for us. From Dylan Horrocks, who's batting at 100% average with 2 out of 2 great books in my reading, to someone else who's currently batting at 100% average, our next book is from Japan. Jiro Taniguchi's The Walking Man, in its expanded edition, the new edition that I've been waiting for years. I've mentioned Jiro Taniguchi in a couple of my other videos. In one of my recent reads videos, I talked about Guardians of the Louvre and a Zoo in Winter, and in one of my shelf videos, I talked briefly about how A Distant Neighborhood is one of my favorite comics of all time. I'd heard a lot about The Walking Man. Its reputation, as they say, preceded it. It might be the first Taniguchi book I ever heard of, but it has never been available, being dangerously out of print, until this expanded edition. As soon as it was available at a decent price, I snapped it up and devoured it, and it's another masterpiece from Jiro Taniguchi. It's difficult to describe why I love his comics so much, but anyone who has ever read any manga by Jiro Taniguchi will know he's an absolute poet of the comics form. The way he is able to express emotion without using words, without even using expressions sometimes, just by juxtaposing scenery and angles, by showing you buildings and trees, landscapes, and a human presence in them. The way he's able to make the panels breathe page after page creates within you a sensation and emotion that is incredible, because I don't know where it comes from. How, when I'm looking through these pages, do I feel this? It's only a master who can really pull this off with the consistency and with the unerring accuracy that he does. When he wants to evoke nostalgia, he evokes nostalgia, even if you are not familiar with the culture that he's talking about. He can have a man walk into a marketplace, buy a paper balloon, inflate it and bounce it in his hand as he walks home, and you know what that feels like, even if you've never done it before, even if you don't even know what a paper balloon actually is. Like with most people who blow me away, I find it very hard to do Jiro Taniguchi justice. And The Walking Man, as a collection of vignettes about a man, a gentle soul who is, as his wife puts it, one of the smartest people she has ever met, it's only stories of walks that he takes. Sometimes he's walking home from work. Sometimes he's decided to not take the train and walk. Sometimes he goes for a walk before dinner is served. There's not really a plot in any of these. These are just experiences of life and the world turning, and a man who is keenly observing everything around him, absorbing it all and allowing himself to feel the pleasure of being alive. Reading The Walking Man felt like listening to music, but not the music that you want in the background as you drive or cook or things like that. It's the kind of music that you turn off the lights and draw the curtains and lie down just to focus on the music itself. it's that kind of thing in comics form. To me, the works of Jiro Taniguchi are a shining example of what the comics medium are capable of, not just because of the imagination in presenting things that you may not see otherwise, like science fiction or fantasy, which we know comics are good at, without talking about interiority or psychology, which we know that comics are good at, but by showing a stage and a player, which is something that I think people will only realize when they read comics such as The Walking Man, a book that has a fantastic reputation and I think is still under-reputed because in my opinion everyone should be talking about how great this book is and what a sublime example of the comics form it is. And the fourth auteur comic that I've read recently is perhaps the most bittersweet of my recent reads. This is Violenzia by Richard Sala. Richard Sala was, as regular viewers of this channel will know, one of my favorite comics creators of all time, and he passed away recently, tragically, unexpectedly, earlier this year, and I made a couple of videos celebrating him that I'll link up here and in the description below. Because he's one of those people who had 20 comics that I love every one of, this was going to be one of the few that I hadn't read, and now that I have read it, there's one less Richard Sala book left for me to read for the first time. Violenzia was published a couple of years ago, but I'd never been able to get my hands on it, and now that I have, it to me is prime Sala. It has a collection of stories, but it's dominated by two long stories about the title character Violenzia, who's almost silent. She very rarely speaks. She speaks only in violence. And the pages of these stories are just one long fight sequence after another. In some ways, it's very unusual for Richard Sala, where you don't really have a very twisting plot the way that a couple of his books do. You don't have incredible verbal exchanges or mysteries that need to be solved like some of his books do. Although there is something mysterious, although there is something larger, it seems to be a much more direct commentary on violence in comics and what we want and what we look for, and here's someone who speaks with their guns and gives you exactly what you as a reader want, and the story doesn't really matter. At the same time, it's full of very trademark Richard Sala things like pretty women and nefarious dastardly plots and villains and people who are trying to control things and people who are rebelling against that control. Whether they're successful or not remains to be seen. To me, this is a lovely companion piece to a book like The Hidden, which also, in a much darker tone and which a much more convoluted plot, had similar things to say about our society and about entertainment. The colors and the line work are exactly what you would expect if you've seen my earlier videos, but what you also get over here are some earlier Richard Sala pieces that are collected here after a long time, and a whole gallery of some of the most wonderful, ghastly, and sexy, because after all it is Richard Sala, pin-ups that you will ever see. A terrific album of Richard Sala's works, but then again, of course, I would say that I'm very heavily biased in favor of this writer-artist. As I said, this was a bittersweet read because with the passing of Richard Sala earlier, we are never going to have more books from him. Violenzia was one of 3 or 4 books that I had of his left to read. Now there's The Grave Robber's Daughter, which has been out of print for so long that I don't know if I'll ever get my hands on it. There's The Bloody Cardinal and the new book of his that remains to be published. And after that, no more new Richard Sala for me. Now I feel I should have taken more time in reading this book and made it last longer. Alongside these 4 reads, I do have a couple more books that I have received but have not yet gotten to reading. 2 of them are Sand and Fury, a Scream Queen adventure by Ho Che Anderson, and The Eltingville Club by Evan Dorkin. Both of these books are by people whose work I'm familiar with. In fact, I've read some Eltingville Club stories in issues of Dork, which was written and drawn by Evan Dorkin. Of course, Evan Dorkin is also the writer behind Beasts of Burden, one of my favorite series and one that I've talked about on this channel before. Ho-Chi Anderson is the writer-artist of King, the terrific biography of Martin Luther King. But this, Sand and Fury, is a very different sounding book. Apart from a very stark and interesting art style and the promise of depraved sex and violence and a hallucinatory story, I was really attracted to this because of the marketing copy, which in a couple of paragraphs managed to push all the right buttons. And that's I want to read that aloud for you. Inspired by the works of filmmakers like David Lynch and Dario Argento and cartoonists like Richard Sala and Charles Burns, a spiritual cousin to Roman Polanski's Repulsion and The Tenant, Sand and Fury is at once a homage to those classic horror sources and a contemporary romantic thriller. So they just dropped the right names for me to pick this up, as if Ho-Chi Anderson by himself wasn't enough. And the Eltingville Club is a collection of short stories and pieces involving these four guys who are dorks, nerds, geeks of a very volatile and almost poisonous nature. This isn't just harmless ribbing, making fun of geeks. They are quite toxic in many ways, and at other ways they're quite sad and pathetic. But the most interesting thing to me about the stories that I've read is that they are so steeped in geek culture and they're so knowledgeable about details and minutiae that you know that Evan Dorkin has to be completely in this material himself. There's no way someone from the outside looking in could possibly write with this level of detail and with this level of incisiveness. So although for the most it does come across as a very lacerating and a biting look at these characters and the kind of attitudes they represent in comic book, science fiction, fantasy, horror, role-playing, expertise and things like that, it at the same time there's also this undercurrent of love and obsession with these same things, which I find to be a very intoxicating and a very alluring combination. I've read about half of this book so far, and you can, because it's short pieces, go in and out of it, and I'm really enjoying myself. They're not the most pleasant people, but then again, a lot of really good stories are about people who are less than pleasant. It's the obsessive detail, both within the characters and about the characters, that I find to be very good storytelling. It's taken me so long to make this video that alongside these, I have got some new comics that include amongst them some more auteur comics written and drawn by the same person, and I've shared those on our community page here on YouTube. So if you haven't checked that out, I'll leave a link in the description below. Looking around me at my shelves, I think about half of the comics I own are actually written and drawn by the same person, and a lot of people that I really enjoy, even when they're collaborating, tend to also have works in which they write and draw themselves, people like Darwin Cook, for example. So one of the requests that I received to make a top 10 writer-artist comics of all time is as challenging for me as making a top 10 comics of all time. Still, I think it might be something I'll take a crack at sometime soon. Let me know what you think of that, or if you can help me out by trying to break it into more bite-sized pieces, I'd love to have your suggestions below. Thank you as always for watching. This has been For the Love of Comics, and I'll see you at the next video.